What is going on, everybody? Welcome back to The Common Coder. My name is Josh, and in this video, we're going to be talking about the basics of CSS. Specifically, we're going to talk about what CSS is, how to use it, the basic syntax, and then look at a bunch of different examples on how you can use CSS selectors, which is the foundation of using CSS to style your HTML. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. All right, so before we get started, there are a couple prerequisites in order to follow along with this video. The first one is that you'll need a basic understanding of HTML, and we're talking very basics here. So you just need to know what HTML is, how to structure your content on an HTML page, preferably using semantic HTML elements, but if you're using generic divs or spans, that's totally fine. The concepts are the same. Now I'm going to be using Visual Studio Code throughout this demo, so I recommend you download and install that before we get started. However, if you are using another editor that you prefer, that's totally fine. You can follow along with any editor. I'll just be using Visual Studio Code throughout this video, and it'll be a little bit easier to follow along if you're using the same tools as I am. All right, with that out of the way, let's go ahead and dive into the basics of CSS. All right, so what exactly is CSS? CSS stands for Cascading Style Sheets, and it is used to style HTML elements. And so when we're talking about styling here, we're talking about fonts, we're talking about colors, layout, positioning, so on and so forth. So an easier way to think about this is to use the analogy of a house. So if we use that analogy, HTML would be the structure of your house. It would be the framing of the house. You know, how many rooms does the house have? How many windows does it have? Where are those windows located? How many doors does it have? Where are those located? So on and so forth. So it's going to be the structure and the framing and the foundation of the thing that you're building. Now, CSS is primarily responsible for the presentation. So there's a separation between the structural elements and the way they are presented. So using the house analogy again, CSS would be, what color paint am I using? What style roof do I have? What type of doorknobs do I have on my doors? What kind of windows do I have in my window frames? What type of carpet do I have? Is it soft carpet? Is it hard carpet? Do I have wallpaper or do I have paint? Do I have pictures on my walls? Things like that. So style in this case is separate from structure. And that's the fundamental thing that you need to understand about CSS. Now, CSS is made up of rules, and we're going to look at a few of these in just a minute. But the first C in CSS is for the cascade. And this essentially means that these rules are applied in order of priority, and the last and or most specific rule wins. And we'll take a look at an example of that in just a minute. But before we get to that, we need to talk about the basic CSS syntax. So all of CSS is going to take this form, which is essentially a selector combined with some properties and some values. So if we take a look at our screen here, selectors are the things that we use to target elements, and we can target them in a variety of different ways. Properties are going to define what it is that you want to change. So in this example, we have the property color, which is going to set the text color of a certain element. And then we have our values, and this is going to specify how you want to change that property. In this case, we're setting color, so it's going to set whatever color that we specify as our value. And so if we look at the color coding here, we have selectors, which is going to be this first part here. In this case, we're targeting any H1 element that exists on our web page, and then we're setting the color property of that element to blue. And all CSS pretty much takes this form. Now the selectors can get quite complicated. You can also add more than one rule inside of these curly braces here, but you're always going to have a selector followed by a set of curly braces and then property names combined with values. So to expand on that a little bit, let's talk about a couple of different ways that we can apply CSS. Now, one of these is going to be the recommended way. There are multiple ways you can apply CSS, but if you're looking for the most flexibility and the most reusability in your CSS code, you're going to want to use an external CSS file, which is that style sheet when you're talking about cascading style sheets. It's meant to be external, but there are ways you can do inline CSS or internal CSS within an HTML file. And we'll go ahead and look at examples of those here in just a minute. So the first way we can apply CSS is inline, and this form of CSS totally omits the selector. So you're basically applying the style directly to an HTML element itself using the style attribute here. So in this case, we have an H1 that says hello, and then we're using the style attribute. Styles always take the form of name equals some value, And so in this case, we're going to put our properties that we want to change on this H1 inside of these quotation marks here. So in this case, we're setting the color to blue, which would render an H1 element with the color blue. Now this would only apply to this H1 element. It's not going to apply to any other elements on the page. So that is the limitation with using inline styles like this. Now there's a separate concept called internal CSS, which is an HTML style element that you can place at the top of your HTML file, and then you can put all of your styles within that element. This isn't really recommended because those styles will only apply to that one specific page. Typically what you'll see is an external CSS file, which is the third bullet point down here at the bottom. But for internal styles, basically you have a style element, and then inside of that style element, you write your selectors. So in this case, we have that same H1 selector that's changing our color to blue. So it's going to target all H1 elements that exist on my page, and it's going to go ahead and set the color of that element to blue. All right, and so anything that exists inside of this style tag, and basically any HTML that is below this style tag, will inherit these styles here. Now, the last and most common way to use CSS is using an external style sheet. And this is a file with a .css extension. And you can see that this is the recommended way of adding CSS to your HTML pages. And the way you do this is you add a link element to your HTML page at the top, and then you give it a rel attribute with the value of style sheet, and then you add an href attribute with the location of your CSS file. So in this case, the CSS file would be at the same level, and then inside of that style.css, we would write our selectors along with our corresponding properties and values that we want to change. So in this case here, we have that same H1. We're using the element selector for an H1. It will apply to all elements on the page that match this selector, setting the color to blue. So let's go ahead and look at some examples of this in a real life demo. So we're going to go ahead and jump over to Visual Studio Code, and I have a very simple HTML page here that just says hello CSS. And what we're going to do is go ahead and style this H1 using some inline CSS, some internal CSS, and then finally extracting that out to an external style sheet. So let's go ahead and do the first way here. I'm going to go ahead and make this just a little bit bigger so we can see it. And first thing that we're going to do is do that inline CSS. So to do that, we add a style attribute, and then inside of the quotation marks for the value, what we're going to do is go ahead and set our color property. And you can see Visual Studio Code's helping us out here with all the different properties that we can style using CSS. So we're going to set the color property to blue. All right, and so I've saved that change. What I'm going to do is go ahead and click this Go Live button here at the bottom. Now this is an extension called Live Server. If you want to know a little bit more about Visual Studio Code extensions, I do have a video that I did on the top 10 extensions for Visual Studio Code, which I'll link up in the card or down in the description below. So I'm going to go ahead and click Go Live, and you can see that we have an H1 element here with blue text that says hello CSS. All right, so if we jump back to Visual Studio Code. Now, before we make any other changes, like I said, this is only going to apply to this element here. So for example, if I had multiple H1 elements, which typically you wouldn't have, usually there's only going to be one H1 element on a page, but let's just say you had more than one, and we'll just say hello CSS again. And if I take this style off of here, save that change, jump back to my browser, and you can see that the second H1 does not have the styling that we had in our first one. So that is the disadvantage of using inline styles, is every single element has to have its own styles, which makes it very hard to change, and it makes it very hard to maintain in the long term. So we can take this a little further and use an inline style element. And to do that, what we can do is go ahead and add a style element to our page. All right, now when using this method of applying CSS, it's pretty common to have that style element or style tag live up here in the head. So we'll go ahead and add a style element here. And then inside of these two tags, the opening and closing tag, we can write our CSS selectors. So rather than having an inline style here, what we can do is go ahead and use an element selector, which is basically just the element type that you want to target. In this case, we're going to target all H1s, and then a pair of curly braces followed by property names. So in this case, we're going to set the color, and we're going to set that to blue. And what we can do is go ahead and remove our inline style. Now, since we have externalized in some fashion, where it's not external to its own file, but it is external, meaning it's out of the HTML elements itself, what this H1 is going to do now is target every H1 that is on this page. So if we go ahead and save this and jump back to the browser, you can see that now we have two blue H1s. We have the first one that we started with, and then we have the one that I added to demonstrate the inline styles only apply to the element that you're using them on. So this is an example of applying CSS internally. However, even this comes with its own set of issues. Like I said, if you're working on just a single landing page and you know these style sheets aren't going to be applied anywhere else, probably okay to go ahead and add it here, but more commonly you're going to see your CSS styles in their own CSS file. So let's go ahead and make that change. Let's go ahead and add a CSS file. So we'll just go ahead and call this styles.css. And then what we need to do here is go ahead and add a link to that style sheet, which we can do using the link, and that needs a rel equals style sheet attribute, along with the href, which is the location of the style sheet, which in this case is going to be styles.css. All right, we'll go ahead and close that off. And if you look at my structure here, I have a separate index and a separate styles.css that we're going to be using in just a few minutes to look at some more advanced styling scenarios. In this case, these are inside of this introduction folder. And so when I link to my style sheet, since it's in the same folder, I reference it at the same path. All right, so I'm gonna go ahead and save this here. And if I jump back to the browser, since my style sheet has nothing in it currently, I should get just the generic browser defaults, which I do. So they're both black with the large text. And if I want to change this, I'm gonna go back to Visual Studio Code, go ahead and add my element selector for H1, and then change my color to blue. And notice that the property names and values are separated by a colon, and then you always want to end that declaration with a semicolon because you can add multiple styles. Typically what you'll see is something like this. So curly braces will be on separate lines with each property being on its own line. So I can add another property here. Let's just go ahead and set the font size to something crazy like 100 pixels. Go ahead and save that and then jump back to my browser. You can see now that is being applied to both elements, not only the color, but the size. And so you can have as many properties as you need to change per selector. All right, so let's go ahead and talk a little bit more about CSS selectors. So like I mentioned earlier, there are multiple different ways that we can select different HTML elements using CSS selectors. So 3 of the most common ways are listed here. We have our element selector, which is what we've been using so far. And this, you just reference the name of the HTML element that you want to style. And this will apply to all of the elements that match that selector. So like we saw in the previous demo, since I had 2 H1s using this H1 color blue, this will change the style of any H1 that happens to be on my page that matches this selector. So whenever you're using element selectors, it's going to apply to every single element that exists on your web page. Now we also have class selectors, and this specific type of selector will target elements with a specific class. And this is specified through the HTML class attribute. And so in this case, to use a class selector, you can use a dot, which basically means you're using a class selector and you're going to target any HTML elements with the class of blue. So jumping back over to Visual Studio Code, if we were to change this, let's go ahead and remove font size. And let's go ahead and change this to a class selector of blue. So we'll say dot blue. And so if you hover over your selector, it'll actually show you how that selector is going to work on the elements that it's targeting. So for example, this will target any element with a class attribute of blue. Let's go ahead and look in the browser real quick, and you can see that we have just our 2 H1s with no styling. And if I jump back to Visual Studio Code and add a class to this H1, and we'll say class equals blue. If I jump back to my browser, you can see now I have my H1 with the class of blue being styled as I expect it to be, because I'm using a class selector inside of my style sheet that's specifically targeting any element with the class of blue. So any element on my page that happens to have this class of blue will automatically get the blue styling. And so you can immediately start to see how powerful this could be. You can create custom classes and then reuse those styles across any elements you want to have that style, which is pretty cool. All right, now jumping back to our other selector types, we also have an ID selector. This works very similar to a class selector. However, per the HTML rules, you should only have one unique identifier on any given HTML page. And so what the ID selector will do is it will target a single element with a specific ID. And so the way you use this, you use a pound or a hashtag along with the associated ID name. So if I had an element with an ID of main heading, it would get this color blue style. And again, jumping back to Visual Studio Code, if I go into my style CSS and go ahead and change this to an ID selector, ID main heading. All right, and you can see if I hover over this, it will tell me any element with the ID of main heading will get this color blue. And again, per HTML, you should only have one of these on your page. So this is going to be a very unique and specific selector. And so in this case, in order to get that style, this H1 would need to have an ID of main heading. And if I save this and jump back to my browser, we can see that I am getting that blue styling here at the top. Now, selectors can get pretty advanced, and we're just scratching the surface here a little bit, but you can also group selectors, so you can target multiple elements at the same time. And this will work with elements, it will work with class selectors, it will work with ID selectors. So the way you do this is you use your selector following with a comma, and then your next selector, comma, next selector, comma, next selector, comma. So these could be elements, like I said, these could be classes. So let's say you had a collection of classes that you wanted to style. You can do, dot blue and dot light blue and dot whatever, and you can have your list of classes here. As long as they're separated by commas, anything inside of the curly brace will automatically apply to any element that matches the selector here. And so this just saves you some typing rather than having to specifically list out, H1, H2, H3, H4, H5, and having each one of those have their own color property of blue. You can group them together like this and apply the styles all at the same time. Now, in addition to that, we have something called combinators, and this is where we start getting into more advanced CSS. And we're just going to scratch the surface here by looking at two of the most common ones you might encounter. One is going to be the descendant selector. And so in this case, we have our selector, which you can see we have main and p. So main is a semantic HTML element that lets the browser know what your main content is, and a p element is going to be a paragraph. So what this is saying is I want to target any paragraph that is inside of a main element. Now, similarly, we have what's called a child selector, and this works almost identically. However, you'll notice there's a little greater than sign, or what kind of looks like an arrow between the main selector and the p selector. And what this does is it targets any paragraph element, or basically any element that is a direct child of whatever that parent element is. So in this case, it's any paragraph element that is a direct child of main. So it would have to be directly underneath the main. If you had some other divs and inside of those divs you had paragraphs, it would not target those. It would only target ones that are direct children. And we'll look at an example of that here in just a minute. Getting even more fancy, we have something called pseudo-classes, which allows us to target an element's state. So for example, if I wanted to style anchor tags specifically when I hover over them, I can use the anchor tag selector followed by a colon and then the pseudo class that I want to target. So in this case, a hover is only going to apply that style when I hover over that element with my mouse. So regularly it would be styled with generic style, and then when I hover over it, it's going to change the color to blue. Now, similarly named but quite different is something called a pseudo element, and this targets a specific part of an element. So we can target space before an element, we can target the space after an element, we can target the first character of an element, so on and so forth. So it really gives us some fine-grained control as to what piece of the element that we're targeting. And so in this case, we are targeting the area before an anchor tag, and we are adding some content. In this case, it's a little link emoji that would apply the link emoji before some link text. And so, like I said, we're going to see examples of all of these because we are now jumping into our demo. So what I'm going to do is go back to Visual Studio Code and close out my existing files, shut down my live server. And what I want to look at is this HTML file. And you can see here that we have a bunch of elements. So we have a header with an ID, and we have a section with an H2, we have a paragraph, another H2, we have a paragraph with a class of highlight. We have an ID selector here. We have another div with a class of container, which has some other stuff inside of it. A little section for child selectors and pseudo classes and pseudo elements. So let's go ahead and open this in the browser to see what we're looking at. And then we'll go ahead and work through this one element at a time. So let's go ahead and open up the CSS file and let's look at the element selector first. And so what we're looking at here is a paragraph selector, and this will target any paragraph that exists on my HTML page. And so what it's going to do is set the font size to 1.1em. This is just a relative measurement that will scale the text up from whatever the default value is. And so it's going to make it 1.1, or basically 10% bigger than what the default is. And it's going to set this color to gray. So if I go back to the browser, and we can see that here is the element selector. This is the paragraph. Probably hard to see, but it is a little bit of a gray color. And if I inspect this element using the dev tools, so you right click and click inspect, here is that paragraph element, and we can see the style down here in the style section of what's being applied to it. So we can see there is that paragraph, the font size is 1.1em, and the color is being set to this gray. All right, and we can see that this is actually working in real time. I can actually change this to something in here, and you can see that all of the paragraphs that are being targeted are changing along with it. right? So you can see there's the red, and you notice how some are changing and some aren't changing, and we'll talk about why that is here in just a second. All right, so I'm gonna go ahead and refresh this to get my styles back. Let's go ahead and look at the class selector next. So go ahead and go back to Visual Studio Code. This class selector, we have a class of highlight, so we can apply this to any element that we want to give kind of this highlighted look to. And what this does is set the background color property to yellow, gives us a little bit of padding around our content. So this is area inside of the bounds of the element. And we'll talk about the CSS box model in another video. And it's also setting the border left, and it's using some shorthand syntax here, basically setting the width to 5 pixels, the type to solid, and the color to this green. And so if I go back to my browser, we can see here is the highlight. So the background color is yellow. It's got this padding around the text here. And so that's what the padding does, is increase the space from the outer portion of the box, and it separates it from the content that's inside. And then we also have this border over here on the left-hand side. Next, we have an ID selector. So we have an ID with the name of unique. And remember, you can always hover over these and it'll tell us exactly how this is going to work. And we can see any element with an ID of unique. And so if I go back to my browser, you can see that that style is being applied to this ID selector. I can go ahead and inspect it again. And we can see that clicking on this, we can see what style is being applied. It is picking up that unique ID selector and setting the color to green and the font weight to bold. Now notice that this paragraph doesn't get the same styles as these other ones. And this is where that cascade comes in and where a concept called specificity comes in. And so when you're using these different type of selectors, each selector type is more or less specific than other selector types. So ID selectors are the most specific, followed by class selectors, which are a little less specific, and then element selectors, which are the least specific of all. And when we hover over these, we can see that it gives us something called selector specificity, which is a number-based value separated by commas, and typically there's 3 of them. And so as your selectors get more specific, they will override the specificity of other elements. So for example, if I had a paragraph with a highlight on it, the class selector highlight would take precedence, and it would also combine. So in this case, if I had a P with a class of highlight, it would give us the font size of 1.1em, it would give us the gray color, and then it would also give us the background color of yellow, the padding of 10, and our border. Okay, and so it would combine these two. However, if there was a conflicting style, that style would be overwritten by the more specific selector. And that's exactly what's happening here. We have our paragraph, which sets our font size to 1.1em and our color to gray. However, when we use the ID selector, since this is more specific, and you can see the 1 value here, so as your values increase from right to left, that selector will overwrite any other selector that is less specific than this one. So in this case, since we're setting the color here to the green, we are overriding the color property from our paragraph here, because our selector specificity of 100 is more specific than our specificity of 001. Now we're just scratching the surface here on specificity and some of these more advanced selectors, so we'll do another video on more advanced CSS concepts in the future. So definitely be sure to subscribe to the channel if that's something you're interested in learning about. So now we have descendant selectors and child selectors. Let's go ahead and take a look at what that looks like. So again, descendant selector, we have a class selector combined with a paragraph selector. And if we hover over this, we can see that this is going to apply to any paragraph that is inside of an element with the class of container. And you notice how the specificity changes here. So this is going to be more specific than a generic selector. And you can see that indicated here by the 2 1s in the selector specificity. All right, so we're combining a class with a paragraph, which is going to be more specific than both individually. And so in this case, we're setting the font style to italic, background color to kind of this off-white, and the padding to 10 pixels. And again, this is going to apply to any paragraph that's inside of an element with the class of container. And if we look at our HTML, see that's exactly what we have. We have a div with the class of container that contains a paragraph. Only this paragraph is going to get the styling. This other paragraph, for example, that is not inside of that container will not get that styling. So if we go back to the browser and take a look, and you can see here is that italics with the gray background and the additional padding. And again, we can always right click on our elements and click inspect, and we can see exactly which styles are being applied to that element using this styles panel here. You can see container, P, font style is italic, background color, and padding. All right, now the child selector is similar, but notice how only one item is getting styled here and the other one is not. And the reason for that is the way that the child selector works. And so what we're doing is targeting a span that is a direct child of a list item. So notice the difference here when we hover over the descendant selector. This could be anywhere nested inside of an element with a class of container. So that's what these little dots stand for. It could be anywhere. So even if it's nested 3, 4, 5 levels deep. However, the child selector, it has to be a direct child of the parent element. So in this case, it has to be a span that's directly inside of a list item. And so if we look at our HTML, we can see that here's our span that is inside of a list item. And this is the one that is being styled using the child selector. However, we have another list item here, but instead of the span being directly inside of the list item, it's inside of a div. And because it's inside of a div and not a direct child of the list item, the style is not going to be applied. And then we can see that if we jump back to the browser and if we right click on this, we'll see that this span is getting our style. So font size 1.2M and color of this kind of aqua blue. However, if we drill into the other list item, to the div and then to the span, we're basically just getting the user agent style sheet, which is the default browser style for a list item. All right, now last but not least, we'll look at the pseudo-classes and pseudo-elements. So if we jump back to our style CSS, for this pseudo-class, remember this targets a specific state of an element. So we can target things like what it looks like when you hover over it with a mouse. And so for this pseudo-demo class, it's basically targeting any element with the class of pseudo-demo while it's in the hover state. All right, so if we jump back to the browser and take a look, if I hover over the paragraph, you can see that I'm getting a styled background whenever I hover over, and then when I leave, that style goes away. And one cool thing that you can do is if you right click and click inspect, and then let's see here is the class with pseudo demo. I can actually toggle that style. You can see here is the :hov. I can click this and this will let me force an element state. So you can see there's various different states that we can look at. So there's active, focus, target, hover, visited, and focus visible. The most common ones you'll see are hover and active and focus. But if I force the hover state, you can see that the gray background appears here. So this is useful for debugging your styles and making sure that your styles look good without having to physically hover over the element while you're testing things out. All right, and the last thing is a pseudo element. And so like I said before, this one lets you target a specific part of an element. And so you can target area before the element, you can target an area after the element, you can target the first letter of an element that contains some text, and that's exactly what we're doing here. So in this pseudo demo, we're gonna go ahead and use the first letter pseudo element, which will target the first letter of text inside of that element. And we're gonna increase the font size of that letter and set the color to green. And we can see that here in the browser, kind of get a cool what we'd see maybe in like a book or a magazine. You have a big first letter followed by your normal text, and notice how it only applies to this first letter here. And so that is pseudo elements. So these sound similar, pseudo classes and pseudo elements. So pseudo classes again allows you to target an element state, and pseudo elements allow you to target a specific part of that element. So like I said, before, after, first letter, so on and so forth. All right, now it's important to know we have all these different styles here, but remember, this is all just HTML. So CSS gives us the styling capabilities, lets us make things look pretty. We can position things, which we'll do a whole video on CSS positioning in the future. But notice if we take our CSS file out, so let's go ahead and jump over to Visual Studio Code and just comment out our style sheet and then go ahead and save this. Notice how our HTML is just basic HTML, right? So this is the structure of our page, has nothing to do with styling, has nothing to do with the presentation or the look and feel or any of that stuff. HTML is meant just for the structure of the content, and CSS allows you to style that in a multitude of different ways. And this is actually illustrated best on a website called CSS Zen Garden. So if we jump over to that website, you can see that we have a pretty nice looking site here that's styled pretty well. And if we click on inspect, we can actually go ahead and comment out or delete the CSS file. So let's go ahead and find the CSS file, which is going to be right here, and delete it. And you can see that this is just the content. So here is, the heading. We got a couple different headings here, different paragraphs, links, so on and so forth. However, when you apply the styling, you can take that content and make it look really, really nice. And so this is the power of CSS here. But to really kind of drive the point home of why CSS is so important and why there needs to be a separation between style and structure is if I click on any of these links here, you can see that we can totally restyle this page and even have some animations and different things happening. And with this change, all we've done is change the CSS file. So if I go back into my head here and I remove that style sheet again, you can see we have the exact same content structure that we had before. And so this is the real power of CSS. It allows you to separate out the content from the presentation, and you can literally style this any way that you want to and keep the underlying structure of the content the same. So this is why it's actually good to have very well structured HTML, because you can style it essentially any way that you want to. So I can go ahead and click on another one of these. This is the exact same HTML, just styled with a different style sheet. Let's go ahead and click another one. This is the one we started with. Let's click on garments. You can see that we have some animation allowing this to load in, have some transparency with a fixed background here. And again, this is all the same content, just with a different style sheet. And so I'd recommend checking out this website, csszengarden.com, and then clicking through, the various themes essentially, and seeing what's possible with CSS. All right, and that is going to go ahead and do it for this video on the basics of CSS. As always, thank you so much for coding along with me today. If you liked this video and found this information valuable, please leave me a like down below, and if you're new here, please consider subscribing. We're going to be learning a lot more about web development, including more CSS, HTML, JavaScript, and everything else in between. So if that's what you're into, I would love to have you along for the journey. All right, well, until next time, be sure to stay curious, never stop learning, and I will see you all in the next video.